What's going on, guys? Aaron from Top Tier Gaming here, and today I am coming at you with a little discussion video talking about Cyberstorm Access and, the format that is right in front of us and what cards you can actually use to combat all the decks in the format that we're going to be dealing with, like Super Heavy Samurai or Pearly, and what cards are good against them and what you might want to consider either siding or maining or just good tech cards for the upcoming format. Maybe some you don't know, maybe some you already do know, and just sort of discussing the pros and cons, or maybe some of the applications of some of these cards. Before we hop into it, I do want to let you guys know Discord link down below, along with all of my other social media links. Also, I'm trying to hit 15,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy this Yu-Gi-Oh content and you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out and what I do here on the channel. And without further ado, let's get into some tech cards for Cyberstorm Access format. So the first thing I want to talk about very briefly is what exactly the Cyberstorm Access format looks like, what is changing, what are the decks we expect to be played. So considering no ban list, of course our current decks like Runic, Sprite, Kashtira, those are all still fine. Mathmech, those are still going to be in the format unless there's a ban list. But the new decks to talk about are definitely Pearly, which is going to be very solid. I'm not sure it's going to be a top contender initially without a ban list, but it's definitely good. And of course, Super Heavy Samurai is another one. This deck is very solid. And of course, Mathmech is getting more support, and that's a deck from this format, but it's getting more support as well. So a Cyberstorm Access format sort of looks like, we also have Mana Dome cards as well. It looks like our current format, but with 3 or 4 decks also added to the mix. And I'm really going to be talking about how to prepare for those decks, because things like Kashtira, things like Sprite, we've been playing with those for 3+ months now in the case of Kashtira, and much longer for Sprite, so we kind of know what cards are already good versus them. Talking about specifically the new decks, right, where what cards do we need to play? So I'm going to go over a couple hand traps first and sort of talk about them, and I think namely the two big ones are Droll and Ghost Ogre. These are very, very, very powerful cards next format. Droll, it is going to be a main deck staple in so many different decks. Any deck running a lot of hand traps, or even only a few hand traps, are going to be maining 3 Droll. And the reason for this is because it absolutely just destroys Super Heavy Samurai. It's a hard counter. It's decent against Pearly. They do have ways to play around it in the draw phase. However, if they do that, they often miss certain effects, or they can't go for their field spell first, which would protect them a little bit. They play into cards like Imperm and Ghost Mourner a little more if they're playing around Droll. So it's okay versus Pearly. It's obviously amazing versus Mathmech. It's great versus Sprite. It's solid versus Kashtira, especially if they open with either Prosperity or Planet or Terraforming. So yeah, Droll is insane now, but going into next format, definitely consider main decking 3 of it. Ogre here, which is also going to see a very large amount of play due to it being also pretty good versus Super Heavy Samurai versus a couple of different cards. It's good versus the Scarecrow, it's good versus the Wakaushi. So Ogre's good versus that deck. It's still very solid versus Pearly as well, because it can hit My Friend Pearly. It can also hit a couple of other things, like you might want to hit some of the monsters sometimes, but My Friend Pearly I think is the biggest one to hit with this card. And yeah, both of these are hand traps that have sort of been not in the limelight. Droll has been good for a while now, this format, but these two are definitely going to be just very, very heavy staples going forward. Now, one thing to note about both of these cards is Gamma is going to be insanely powerful. One, because every Super Heavy Samurai list is going to be on it to counter both of these cards. For people who want to Ogre the Wakaushi when they have no monsters, Gamma is an insane counter. Same thing with Droll, they search, they have no monsters, and they Gamma. So when you're using these, you might want to consider Gamma, because every list is going to be playing it as far as Super Heavy Samurai is concerned. Mathmech as well loves this card, and it also hits Droll, and it can negate things like D-Shifter, so keep in mind Gamma when you are using these cards. Another hand trap I want to recommend people consider is Retaliating Sea. Now, Retaliating Sea is more specifically for Pearly. It hits a couple of other matchups, but I did mention my hand trap tier list. I misread Retaliating Sea, or misremembered because I hadn't read it in so long. I thought it said when your opponent activates a spell card or effect, and I was talking about how this could also be good versus Super Heavy Samurai because you could hit Wakaushi. You can't do that because it does not say spell card or effect. The activation of the spell card has to have an effect that it's trying to resolve that special summon. So this is good versus Pearly specifically because it's essentially macrocosmos for them on any of their spells that special summon. And I think Retaliating Sea is going to be very good versus that deck. However, it also is good versus like Branded, right? Like Branded, activate Branded Fusion, you can macro them, which isn't amazing. Like it's not turning off their turn, but it is cutting them off of like several lines, so it's not terrible against Branded. Has some overlap there. Versus Mathmech, it can hit like Equation. Versus Drytron, obviously on Nova. It does have some sort of like mix with other decks to counter as well. But note that this is mostly just a good out for Pearly, potentially, if you want to side more cards against it. Another card to talk about, the last hand trap I have on this sort of list of cards, is going to be the Bystials. Now, the thing about Bystials is this is mostly for Mathmech, in my opinion. This is very good versus Mathmech, but it's also pretty solid versus Branded, which is going, it's getting more support. Both of those decks are getting support. Siding like 3 Magnemute and like a Druis Worm might be okay. Obviously, for any Bystial combo decks out there as well, you'd want to be either maining this, but you can also side them against that deck. So I do think Bystials in the side deck are looking solid for next format as well, which I think they have been for this format, but continuing in next format, I think they are still fine. Alright, talking about some board breakers to help you into Cyberstorm Access format. And for every deck that is going to be new or even continuing from this format, the very standard board breakers we've been playing with for such a long time work, right? Like, obviously a Kaiju will work, things like Dark Ruler No More are completely fine. Things like Sphere Mode or Lava Golem, if your deck can play them, are still very solid. So, like, all those I'm not really going to be talking about. The standard board breakers are still fine. Evenly gets worse because of super heavy Samurais like Mega, 17 negate board. So you might want to kind of see how the format plays out for that one. But talking about Pearly, because you want to like board break Pearly, very different from many decks we've seen previously. So cards like Xyz Encore and Herald of the Abyss, these are two cards that are going to see a little bit more play in side decks. Maybe even main decks with Thrust, depending on how popular Pearly actually is. Keep in mind, these cards are very good because even though Noir is unaffected by card effects, these both work even though he's unaffected, because Herald of the Abyss makes the opponent do it, and Xyz Encore just detaches materials, which doesn't actually affect the monster. So yeah, that is why these cards are going to see an uptick in play. Now, more generically, Gamma Seal is definitely, and by Gamma Seal, any Kaiju, whichever ones you want to play, whether it's like a Small World Bridge and Mathmech, so something like Jizukiru. But Gamma Seal, very generically, is going to be very good against Pearly if you're able to put up like a lethal offense that turn as well, because they will get pluses off of Gamma Seal, which is really annoying. They'll get their My Friend Pearly. If they have the field spell, they'll be able to special summon. So they're getting a lot of value and follow-up, but as long as you're able to like push for game, it doesn't really matter. So Kaijus, as well as if Kashtira is still in the format, barring, any ban list hits, then Kaijus are very good versus that deck as well. So these remain fine. Now, because Kaijus, and also if you're playing Pearly, you're going to want to be playing Santa Claus, I should mention that. If you are specifically playing Pearly, you're going to want to play this card. For every other deck, I think it's better to play Kaijus. But yeah, I think for Pearly, you're going to want to play this, so I do want to mention that. Now, Pearly knows that it's very weak to Kaijus. So talking about some going first cards in the format, specifically if you're wanting to play Pearly, I think a big one I've seen, really there's two, I've seen a couple of different things Pearly players have done. Vanity's Fiend is something I've found very interesting, some people playing, because if you're able to establish your Xyz, like a 5 material Noir, and then you're able to tribute for Vanity's Fiend, you're no longer weak to Kaijus, which means they have to have like Herald of the Abyss. Can they even activate this card? Maybe? I think maybe you can still activate this under Vanity's Fiend. Don't quote me on that. I haven't even really fully read the card and thought about the interaction, but Vanity's Fiend is here to stop Kaijus, and obviously Vanity's Fiend is an insane card as well. So I've seen, be aware that some Pearly players, depending on how the format goes, might be playing counter sides like Vanity's Fiend, where Kaijus and Santa Claus aren't as good, and you may need to rely on cards like these specifically. Another thing is obviously standard cards like Rivalry. General, these going first in general, you'd rather Gozen Match, right? I'm not here to talk about our standard Floodgates we know are good, but some going first options, obviously this is very good versus Pearly. not versus Super Heavy Samurai. Neither is this one versus Super Heavy Samurai. But as a Pearly player, you could play something like Rivalry to stop a Kaiju from going over your Noir, right? So similar vein to Vanity's Fiend, this is a good card. Now, a card I want to recommend for siding first against Super Heavy Samurai, and some people are going to know about this card, some people may not. It's been picking a lot of hype, so most people probably will, is Performapal 5 Rainbow Magician. Now, this card is essentially Mystic Mine against Super Heavy Samurai because the Pendulum Effect says, if your opponent, let me rephrase this. Any player who controls 0 set cards, all monsters they control cannot activate or cannot attack or activate their effects. Super Heavy Samurai cannot run spells or traps, so they end up having no engine way to beat this card. Just activating this and it going unanswered is an FTK versus Super Heavy Samurai if you're going first. So if your deck can easily set one back row, be it a normal spell or anything, you can play under this card and your opponent can't. So this is a card that is definitely going to see some play depending on how good Super Heavy Samurai is. Now, counters that Super Heavy Samurai can play to this card, Archfiend Eccentric is one that can beat this, so I've seen people play this, obviously. And then I've even seen people talk about playing Artifacts, just because if Lancia is like a decent hand trap versus whatever version Kashtira is playing, or versus Runic, which is another thing to talk about Retaliating Sea that I forgot to mention. Runic decks going forward, this card is amazing versus Runic, so keep that in mind for Retaliating as well. I've kind of missed like the window where I was talking about this card, but for anyone still watching, yeah, do keep in mind this is good versus Runic too. But yeah, there's some decks you'd want to side in Lancia for anyways, but in Super Heavy Samurai specifically, these are cards you can actually set in your spell and trap zone, so it can actually be an out to Performapal 5 Rainbow Magician. It also can stop things like Evenly Matched, cards like this. So I don't know, maybe Lancia will see an uptick in play. I think for every deck that's not Super Heavy Samurai, you would need a really good reason to run this card, be it your deck loses to Evenly or you're really afraid of Kashtira, like completely locking you, but we don't even know what a ban list will do. But yeah, I think this is all I want to talk about in this video. Let me know down below any cards you're thinking about playing for next format, any tech cards I've missed. Obviously, there's a bunch of cards that are potentially good next format, and some cards that are getting far less good, which I didn't really cover in this video, because I think we'll need to be in the format a bit to talk about whether Nibiru is going to be a good card, right, or what cards get a lot weaker. And yeah, I think this is a pretty good baseline for this video. So yeah, let me know what you think down below. I'll be sure to read your comments. This has been Aaron from Top Tier Gaming. Bye, YouTube.